Our next guest has been writing, as usual, a torrent of interesting output, including a couple pieces about the Donald Trump phenomenon I found quite interesting. Nathan J. Robinson has been on the program before. He is a PhD candidate in sociology and social policy, and he is the editor of the fine new magazine Current Affairs. He is the author of a couple books, including Trump Anatomy of a Monstrosity, and he joins us now. First of all, Nathan, thanks for coming back on the program.
Well, thank you very much for having me back.
How could I resist after you've written a couple pieces about Trump that I thought put the phenomenon and by the phenomenon, I'll get to that in a second, of, let's call it Trump reactivity in what I think is the right context. One of those pieces, which was headlined "Notionally True," is about the Wolff, the Michael Wolff book, Fire and Fury. The other is about something that might be called Trump derangement syndrome. But let's start with the Michael Wolff book. A lot of people are pleasure reading it now. It's got an enormous audience, and it has also created a lot of controversy in journalistic circles. So first of all, let's start with this. I thought your piece was very well balanced on it. What's your take overall on the Michael Wolff book?
Well, as I say in this, there's something that I really love about it first, which is that Michael Wolff is really gutsy. There's a reason that this book is selling so well and is so different, and one of it is that one of the reasons is that Michael Wolff had the courage to do what a lot of journalists don't, which is to try and get access to powerful people and then burn all of his bridges and expose the whole thing. And so there's something I have to say, before we get into the sort of critiques of the book, there is something that I like that he did, which is that kind of willingness to betray your sources in the name of journalism. Which is very rare among DC journalists, many of whom cozy up to the powerful, many of whom know a lot of things that they don't disclose because they realize it's going to jeopardize their future access. And so, Michael Wolff was in the White House. He got up close and personal, and then he told the whole story. So I like that aspect of it, and so I'm really frustrated by the book because I think if you got that close and you talked to so many people and you were really in the inner circle, you should produce something that we can really trust, because if you're going to try and bring Trump down, you have to be very careful. And we've written about this before in Current Affairs about the need for anti-Trump journalists to have credibility, so that it's not as easy for people on the right to make the charge of fake news and to dismiss the things you're saying. So you have to be really careful. And I felt, looking through the book, which sort of notoriously doesn't have any of its sources listed or any citations, I really felt like it was an incredible, frustrating disappointment in ultimately.
Yeah, I think that's a great take. It's somewhat, in fact, quite similar to my own. In some cases, I had articulated my feelings in my own head. In some cases, you gave voice to them. But overall, I would say, first of all, yes, good for him for burning all his sources in the name of journalism and truth-telling. It's what we're supposed to do. Secondly, good for him in a sense for going for it, even if it meant violating the sort of in-group behavioral norms of both journalism and politics, including, let's face it, he deceived people for a year. And while I'm not, not in favor of deceiving audiences or even necessarily subjects, in this case, it was so important that he kind of took a gonzo approach, if you will, almost method acting, to adopting the character necessary to get the story. I think all of that is intriguing and a net plus, complicated, but a net plus. That said, I guess I have the same objections you do plus one, and I'd love your thoughts on this. One,
Okay.
I do have the objection that if you're going to get uh, all that insider information, present it in such a way that it's unimpeachable for what essentially you articulate is a tactical reason, because if you present it unimpeachably, it won't be impeached, to use that suddenly once again popular word. But also, I have to say, and this is something that I have also written about in terms of the anti-Trump movement and talked about, and it's something that bothers me at an even deeper level, which is, to me, a progressive movement or a left movement, whatever you want to call it, that advocates for change but does not value truth and honesty as a primary ideal that stands on its own, regardless of its tactical worth. To me, is not that worth defending. And to me, too many people in the anti-Trump camp have been willing to promote obviously bogus or potentially bogus stories that they don't know to be true without any consideration for, am I telling the truth? And that to me is a violation of principle just as much as accelerating economic inequality is a violation of principle. I don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, because I mean, if one of the main criticisms of Trump is that he tells, just outrageous lies, and that he's killing the concept of truth in politics and bringing us into a post-truth era, well, we have to react to that by supposedly that suggests that we care about the truth and we're very angry when someone, treats it casually. And if that is what we believe, if that's the principle, then we have to be in our own discussions of those who are our political enemies or opponents. We have to be scrupulous in our attention to the facts. So when we criticize Trump, we have to care whether what we're saying about him is true. I mean, even if it's a very satisfying thing to believe about him. If our standard is no, we care about the facts and he doesn't care about the facts, well, you can't embrace something using a standard that is different from the standard that you're criticizing him for not adhering to. And so, what with the Michael Wolff book, one of the things I was thinking about was, well, how would we feel if a sort of gossipy book about Barack Obama had come out in 2010 and made all sorts of allegations, but didn't cite any of the sources that these allegations came from? Would we believe it? Will we be as inclined to believe it? Will we give it the same kind of benefit of the doubt that has been afforded to Michael Wolff? And I think the answer is obviously that a lot of people who've embraced Fire and Fury would not feel the same way about an Obama book that had the same level of evidence for its accusations. And that to me suggests a lack of principle. And I care about the principle because I'm very serious when I criticize Trump for not telling the truth. And so, yeah, I think you have to be consistent, or else people aren't going to believe you, and they're going to believe that the things you say are just being said for reasons of political convenience rather than because you actually believe them.
Yeah, I strongly agree with everything you just said, Nathan J. Robinson, except that I would clarify the word people in your last sentence about whether
Okay.
a lot of people will believe you, but there are people who already agree with you, or, there are people who share a confirmation bias that you have. Now, I will tell you, when the book came out and all the revelations were coming out, it was interesting, and I'm probably making too much of a single choice of words, but what I put out on social media was that I will re-engage my critical faculty tomorrow. Today, I'm just going to enjoy all the juicy gossip, or some words to that effect. And a really pretty prominent Democratic journalist tweeted back at me, "Wise move." Now, I wouldn't call it wisdom. I would just call it a kind of, I'm going to enjoy this for a day. And then I'm going to start thinking about the stuff you and I are talking about. I wasn't wise or not wise. It was emotional. So, but I guess what I get is that a lot of people are now mistaking gossip mongering for wisdom. We know there's a lot of dirt about Donald Trump, incredibly salacious dirt, incredibly outrageous dirt, that is unquestionably true, in my opinion, whether it's a Stormy Daniels thing that's come out now, whatever it is, there's an awful lot on Trump. We don't need to stretch the truth to have dirt on Trump, and yet it seems to be that a primal human instinct is engaged here among his opponents. It's very evident, for example, every night on MSNBC or wherever else you want to look at. No matter how much dirt we find, it's not enough. We've got to amplify, we've got to exaggerate. And in that sense, I think, as we've said now, both of us, we're undermining our values, but we're also undermining our ability to be politically effective in the future, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. If you believe that part of political effectiveness is going to entail convincing people that you're right, who don't necessarily already agree with you, and so if Trump says, if one of his big pitches to people is, well, the media is just out to get me, they'll just make up any old thing. They don't really care who says it or whether it's true. This is his perspective on all the Russia stuff, where he says, well, they'll just believe anything without any evidence. And then often, well, it turns out that that is kind of the case, because I mean, CNN had to retract a big story about Russia when they made a claim they couldn't substantiate. The Washington Post had another thing where they claimed that a bunch of things were, pro-Trump Russian propaganda that they had no evidence for, right? So it validates Trump's criticisms of the media, and you really don't want to validate anything Donald Trump is saying. So you've got to be careful that the things to make sure that the criticisms he makes of you aren't true, right? Because if the criticisms that he makes of you are true, and the criticisms you make of him aren't necessarily true, then you've got a serious public credibility problem. And people aren't foolish. They're going to notice this. They're going to notice if you can't back up the things that you say about him, but he can back up the things that he says about you. And so as I think one of the strongest points against Trump is the fact that he's detached from reality, he says things that are exaggerations and lies, you need to be able to show that to people in a way that doesn't end up with you descending into, no, you're a liar, no, you're a liar, and nobody knows what's true, and we're in a post-truth era.
So, how long have you been Putin's puppet?
Well, yeah, we've been accused of that
Oh,
by a couple of people who go, well, clearly, if you question any of these charges, you must be in the pocket of Russia. Now, we don't get this nearly as much as someone like Glenn Greenwald gets it, right? Where he's constantly going, but I need evidence, and then people are going, well, that sounds like something that someone on Putin's payroll would say.
right. I've gotten that too. Nobody gets it as much as Glenn Greenwald. But it pivots in the couple minutes we have left to the other piece you wrote that recently that I appreciated, which is not to say I don't appreciate the others too, but Trump accept. Now, I'm going to quote your headline, assuming you wrote it because you're also the editor. Trump exceptionalism will kill every last one of your brain cells, making the point that, among other things, that George W. Bush, who is currently being lionized in certain Democratic circles, and we saw Philippe Reines, one of Hillary Clinton's closest advisors, tweeting out love for, I think, Bill Kristol or one of those guys, that we are now seeing a sudden loss of perspective, in the sense that while he may be uniquely horrific in his personal life and financial life, we don't really have all the details, that certainly George W. Bush is a much greater war criminal than Trump at this point, which you point out, this notion that somehow Trump is so uniquely terrible, I think is not only unsupported by the facts, but is also another terrible tactical mistake, because even if the fantasy were to become reality and Trump were to be impeached, we would have arguably someone just as horrible on policy, Mike Pence, become president, and Pence would arguably be more effective at passing that horrible policy into law. I just want, I'm old enough to remember when Bush was uniquely horrible because everyone had forgotten Ronald Reagan. So
Right.
do we just never learn?
Well, yeah, well, I mean, I started this article with Dick Durbin's remark after Trump made his vulgar, disparaging comment about Haiti and Africa, where, Dick Durbin goes, well, I can't believe that any president has ever said something racist and vulgar, right? And you think, well, have you heard the Nixon tapes? Have you
Right.
heard Lyndon Johnson? I mean, clearly that's false, right? And so when you start holding Trump up as this aberration from the great norms of the American presidency, and longing for a return to these civil and decent and morally humane people that always inhabited the office beforehand, well, you exonerate the crimes of the Johnson, Nixon administration, the Reagan administration, the Bush administration. So you exonerate their crimes, and you also, as you say, prep us to not be as outraged if Trump disappears, because it's the things that are unique to him as a person that we're outraged about, rather than looking at the actual substance of his actions and seeing things in perspective. So when people say, well, I've never seen such a warmonger, a guy who is engaged in this kind of nuclear brinksmanship. And you think, well, what was the history of the Cold War, right? What we need to understand what presidents do and what presidents have done, and criticize the things that are outrageous on their own terms, rather than just seeing everything Donald Trump does as some unique departure. And when we get rid of it, everything will be fine again, because everything won't be fine again, because it was never fine.
No, and I think that those who would like to see a return to the bipartisan status quo would like us to believe that. But to me, the great horror of Donald Trump, the greatest horror of all, is the way in which he resembles his predecessors, not the ways in which he differs. But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. As always, Nathan J. Robinson, editor of Current Affairs. Great reading you and great talking with you. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks, RJ. Thanks for having me.